next, I want to talk about two related humanistic theories of personality. I started with what's proposed by Carl Rogers. So after we've now taken a hiatus to examine the contributions of behavioral scientists, we're back to a therapist's perspective in this post-Freudian era, but with the benefit of the behaviorist revolution and learning theories to build upon. So we come to Rogers. He studied Freudian theory, but he disagreed on the implications. So Freud thought criminals, for example, should stay in prison forever because the impulses of their id wouldn't change. Rogers instead believed in rehabilitation. Later, Rogers was a behaviorist, right, until he himself had a baby, and he said, "Oh well, I actually don't think that children are just a blank slate, right, where they're just a function of the reinforcement that the environment gives them." And so he goes in a third direction, becoming a humanist. So to understand this philosophy, you can listen to Rogers' own words. He said that the subjective human being has an important value, right? That no matter how they may be labeled and evaluated, they're a human person first of all. So he believed in the worth of every human being and the importance of helping people make the most out of their abilities. So he's not into psychological dysfunction, right? And instead he prioritizes maximizing normal functioning. For him, the core motive for humans is to self-actualize, right? To be able to grow to be our best selves. And so all the learning theorists are showing us mechanisms for how we might learn things. And he says that learning is growth, right? So if you're learning a new song or learning how to build something, all that stuff is all growth. I believe we have an innate desire to be better. And alternatively, we hate stagnation. So chores or things that are needed but don't teach us anything, or dead-end jobs, right? We will get frustrated if we're not growing. So Rogers isn't focused on personality per se as much as the self, the organized, consistent, conceptual whole, comprised of your perceptions of the characteristics of you, which sounds a lot like definitions of personality. But for Rogers, your self is whoever you think you are, which may sound like a definition without content, but importantly, who we think we are isn't always how we behave or who we actually are. Right. Rogers also suggested that people tend to have a concept of their ideal self. So the problem is that our image of who we think we should be does not always match up with our perceptions of who we are today. So when our self-image doesn't line up with our ideal self, we're in a state of incongruence. By receiving unconditional positive regard, and by pursuing the actualizing tendency in all of us, however, people can come close to reaching a state of congruence. One's current self and their ideal self can have more of an overlap. And so, through years of counseling people, he identifies this need for positive regard that's from oneself about oneself and from others about oneself. And so these concepts together, they encapsulate the need for individuality and connection that Fromm talked about, but also a desire to learn, which is what learning theorists are talking about. So Rogers is taking the best of the ideas around him and making something new with it. So Rogers believes all of us are good seeds. We're all good, but the environment you plant seeds in matters. So this echoes the evidence that contexts matter, which is what behaviorists have been talking about, and that early environments matter, which is what the psychoanalysts have been talking about. And he proposes two pathways towards personality development: conditional positive regard and unconditional positive regard. So the negative form of development, this unhealthy form of development, is if you are receiving conditional positive regard. Right? This conditional positive regard can be reflected by an if-then conditional acceptance. If you study, then I will approve of you. If you eat your vegetables, then you're a good boy or a good girl. He argues that inevitably this is going to lead to a fragmented self because inevitably you won't want to do everything that others tell you to do. Right? A sense that who you think you are, which is a good person, right, doesn't match with your experiences because they're saying you're not a good person yet to do this thing that I'm telling you to do. And that can lead you to feel like you can't trust your own opinions, you can't follow your own desires, you need to follow the desires of others. That's where you're going to get disapproval. And so he argues that living with conditional positive regard fosters anxiety and defense mechanisms, which he argues are counterproductive and bad for mental health, can prevent you from that growth and self actualization. Conversely, positive development results from unconditional positive regard. Right? Parents who say, I love you regardless, right? But those bad things that you're doing are going to hurt others or they're bad for you. Right? So as opposed to there being good kids and the bad apples, right? No, you're a good kid, you're not a bad apple. It's just this behavior is kind of productive and we want you to do something different. Right? Or a professor who says, I believe in all of you. You all have tremendous potential. Right? It's not about the talented or the untalented. Right? We're not weeding people out here. Right? We just understand that there are those with good habits and those who are maximizing, as opposed to those who aren't yet. Or you might hear it from an employer who recognizes that there aren't talented and untalented people. It's not that you have it or you don't, but talent can be developed. Right? All industrious individuals have something to contribute if they're well trained. Rogers argues that receiving unconditional positive regard leads you towards your real self. If you get to be yourself, trust your own intuitions, trust your own desires for how you want your life to unfold, and it allows you to self-actualize. And it doesn't mean that you have never received punishment, but just when somebody does bad things, right, the act was what was punished, right? And so they felt that regard. It's not about you, not about you think you're a bad person, but focusing on the act. And so Rogers argues that there are infinite self-concepts, ways of thinking of oneself, right, but they all fit into two broad categories. One that's self-actualizing, right, where you can be your real self, right, who you are and your ideal self are congruent, right? That's primarily characterized by a person who's self-accepting, right? But there are many variations within that category. And then a second broad category, individuals who are fragmented or incongruent, right? And that's fundamentally, primarily characterized by people with high anxieties. Now, Rogers was deeply influential for providing evidence that unconditional support leads to creativity, right? And the benefits of growth mindsets. So as opposed to saying that there are good and bad people are fixed, right, with certain values, that everyone can grow and everyone can develop. Growth mindsets have proven to be hugely influential, particularly in modern educational theory. Right? In the past 20 years, the importance of these kinds of growth mindsets have really taken off, and largely due to Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck, who's really popularized this concept right, outside of even psychological circles into the public consciousness. And according to Dweck, at the heart of what makes the growth mindset so useful is that it creates a passion for learning rather than a hunger for approval. Right? So even the modern take on growth mindsets really is tapping into Rogers' theory. The hallmark of a growth mindset is the conviction that human qualities like intelligence and creativity, and even relational capacities like love and friendship, can be cultivated through effort and deliberate practice. In addition, there were huge shifts in how therapy was done after Rogers. He popularizes person-centered therapy, and the goal of humanistic psychotherapy in general is to help the client become a fully functioning person. And to achieve this goal, the therapist develops a genuine and caring relationship with the client and provides unconditional positive regard. And so this shift in role in how a therapist engages with their patient is very different after Rogers. Right, now, our last theorist that we're going to cover is Abraham Maslow, who's famously developed the hierarchy of needs. Who's very similar to Rogers, but there are some key distinctions. So Rogers believed that self-actualization was the form of the fully functioning individual and that it was available to all. And Maslow believed that self-actualization is just the ideal of an individual that most of us will never reach. Right? And the most lofty of all of our developmental needs. Right? It's only sought after, most others have been fulfilled. Right? So whereas Rogers believes that this is the core motivator, and Maslow says that's the end of the road. Right? That's the highest up on the hierarchy, and we have many needs that we have to meet before we can start to think about self-actualization. And so in terms of Maslow's training and where his ideas originate from, he's originally a behaviorist also. He studies under Harry Harlow, who does a lot of primate research. And then he becomes a psychoanalyst and was mentored by Alfred Adler, who you'll recall focused on the striving for superiority and perfection with society. Maslow was critical of Freud. Specifically, he said that, quote, "It is as if Freud supplied us the sick half of psychology, and we must now fill it out with the healthy half." So Maslow worked primarily with the highest achievers, those who were the most fulfilled, the most healthy. He wanted to examine what it is that separated those people, the elite, from just the average person. So he used Albert Einstein and other superachievers as case studies to understand human personality. And so Maslow considered himself a humanistic psychoanalyst, believed in the worth of every human being and the importance of helping people make the most of their abilities, and also very much into maximizing the normal functioning of human beings. Right? And he is also about self-actualization, right? But for him, it's just one of many needs that humans have. Right? So he believes that our core motives are a set of basic needs. Right? Self-actualization is just one of them. He developed this hierarchy of needs, which explains all of our needs in their hierarchical order. So he says there are 5 needs. Right? The bottom 4, those first 4 are deficiency needs. They're needs where if they're not met, they leave you feeling deficient. Right? You must partially fulfill these at least before reaching for self-actualization, that 5th in the hierarchy of needs. It says that self-actualization is different too because this gives you positive feelings when met more than deficiency when it's unmet. So for Maslow, the lower needs are related to biological needs, whereas the higher needs are related to psychological needs. Right? The lower needs are closely related to basic survival. The higher needs are related to quality of life. And so you can see the kinds of concerns that are involved in each of the needs proposed by Maslow. He argues, again, you don't have to perfectly meet one level before you start considering the next. It's not all or nothing. But you do need to at least have partially met it. And if you're in a state where you're lacking at a lower level, it might block your ability to move past until that baser need is met. He described individuals and their personality as largely dominated by whatever needs there are that are unmet. So if you haven't met your physiological needs, right, your personality is mostly going to be described by thirst and hunger. Maslow would say that the homeless are frequently stuck here. Right? But if you move past that point, right, now your personality is largely around gaining fear, feeling insecure. Right? If you have your physiological needs met, but not your safety needs met, right, that's what's going to drive your personality. But if you have your safety needs met, then you can start to consider love and belonging. If you haven't met love and belonging needs, then you're going to feel loneliness, emptiness, you're going to feel unwanted. But if you move past that stage, you can think about self-esteem. If you can't meet your esteem needs, then you're going to feel inferiority, incompetence, negativity. If you meet all of those four base needs, then you can start to strive for self-actualization. Now, without self-actualization, again, you don't feel the same negatives, but you would feel boredom, that everything is routine, that it doesn't hold much meaning. Maslow outlines the characteristics of the self-actualizers that he studied. Right? They're creative, they're spontaneous, they're open to new experiences, they're accepting of themselves, right? They have social interest, they're democratic, right? They feel everyone has a value, everyone should have a voice. It's not that life was easy, they're challenged by life, and they're constantly appreciative. And importantly, happiness is not included here, right? But having meaning in your life is. So Maslow describes those who are self-actualizing persons as fulfilling themselves by making complete use of their potential. It's not that they're perfect. Right? Look at the bottom, lots of imperfections are still characteristics of self-actualizing persons. You don't have to be perfect, but despite that, he argued that it's extremely rare to be a self-actualizing person. In his initial survey of college students, he argued that only 1% met his criteria. Rogers would argue that anyone can self-actualize. So there's an important pragmatic difference. Maslow would reply that sure, anyone can, but how many people have all their other needs met? How many people get unconditional positive regard? So he argues that only a rare few end up being fully self-actualizing individuals. In terms of personality development, Maslow would argue that your personality develops as you meet your basic needs. And so you can progress in developing a more complex personality as you move up the hierarchy of your needs. And so your first personality is hungry. Your final personality would be a complete self-actualizing person. You develop in terms of complexity and depth of personality as you move through the hierarchy of needs. And second, it would say that as you progress, right, there are infinite personalities that can be expressed along that spectrum as you're moving through the hierarchy of needs, right? But that those infinite personalities would be dominated by their current need state and the emotions they felt based on whether or not their needs were met. Now, this is as opposed to Erickson, who looked at personality developing over stages of life, right, giving you trust and intimacy, etc. Maslow instead says that personality develops hierarchically. So it's related to moving up the pyramid as opposed to through your life stages. Now, despite using non-experimental methods, Maslow was highly influential. Right? He termed his work positive psychology, which is a terminology that exists today. The subfield of positive psychology is a healthy, thriving subdivision of psych research. In addition, the hierarchies of needs has received future empirical support. So, for example, Wicker et al. In the 90s conducted a study to test the theory that the lower level needs in the hierarchy are more problematic when not fulfilled as compared to the higher level ones. So the researchers asked participants questions about their feelings towards attaining or not attaining goals within different levels in the hierarchy, such as food and being part of a group. These findings showed that participants displayed more negative reactions if they were unable to attain the lower level needs. However, when looking at attaining the goals, more positive reactions were found towards achieving the higher level needs rather than the lower level needs. So this therefore supported Maslow's idea that lower level needs are more important in terms of survival, and therefore more important than higher level ones when not fulfilled. In addition, there have been many practical applications of his theory. Take a few examples in terms of student success. There's an organization called City Connects, which has addressed achievement gaps in lower income students by addressing, do kids have enough food? Do they have stability? Right, let's look at people as a whole and not just look at them in their academic context. And that's how we can facilitate achievement. Or when looking at employee motivation, right, there's work that shows that employees must feel secure before they're willing to show initiative and imagination, and that secure employees want to express themselves through their work by contributing to the organization's goals. In addition, This work has helped us understand happiness in different cultures. Right? So we see that financial and economic status is more important in poorer countries than in richer countries, whereas home life and happiness in home life is more important in richer countries relative to poorer countries. And so, despite the lack of experimental methodologies, Maslow is one of the most cited psychologists and deeply influential in both creating a tradition of positive psychology research and in inspiring multiple practical applications for how to use psych research to improve people's lives. And let's stop there.